Let's go back to when Brad Holmes told us that he was after sustained success. He didn't want to have a couple good years, and that was, all right, we had our years there. Okay, let's try it again. It was, let's have sustained success. And right now, the Lions are attempting to do that. But here's where things get difficult. Here's where the tough decisions have to be made, where certain players may not be brought back, even though they're good players. They may just have not earned the extension because you may have a given extension elsewhere. And that's where things get difficult. The strategy in theory sounds great. Just extend the guys you drafted, but especially when you have a lot of high draft picks early on, it makes it difficult. And that's what the Lions are entering into, is the question that gets prompted, is the Lions window closing? Is the Super Bowl window closed for the Lions? I mean, look, here's the thing. This whole thing is crazy, by the way. The whole, is it closed already? Obviously not. But most of the people that make the argument that it is closed is simply just Ben Johnson is gone. The offensive coordinator's gone. They don't even bring up Aaron Glenn, which is disrespectful. But it's just like, hey, your coordinators aren't here. And then when Frank Ragnow retired, now it's like, oh, if people thought it was closed already, now it's officially closed. Frank's gone and the coordinators are gone. Close the window. It's done. Don't tell Philly that. That's things. There's a lot of those decisions that are, I think, undecided right now. Maybe there's a lean, but there's just not a complete, hey, we know, because that's the point, right? We're going to let these guys prove and earn that extension. It shouldn't be very cloudy when we make that decision of extending a player. It should be very straightforward. When we give out a big extension, you're going to know why that guy got the extension and why they decided to go that direction, because they could trust that that guy was going to continue to get better and better, and he made all the sense in the world. So that's the positive, is there should be clarity with moves going forward, but it is going to be some tough decisions going forward. So let's dive into this. There was really two articles that I found about windows, and then I wanted to talk about it anyway, but I just found these as a reference point. First off, PFF did their Super Bowl windows list. I'm not sure exactly what it was based on, but they had the Lions at number 5. One was the score, said that the Lions window was open, but it's closing. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Why is that the case? And their arguments were they lost Ben Johnson and Frank Ragnow just retired. So it really had nothing to do with anything. It was just like, well, because it is, I guess. So with that, I was like, all right, let's expand on this. I think ultimately you're going to have some pillars in place. You got to have the head coach that's still here. You got to have the quarterback. As soon as you don't have the quarterback, yeah, that window is going to close up pretty quickly. So those things need to be in place. So right now for the Lions, at least they have those things in place, and now you have to shuffle around some money as we go forward. So with that being kind of the jumping off point, I want to get into some strategies the Lions can implement. First, contract situations. On the right, you're going to see that that's when the player becomes a free agent. Okay, so that's basically how long they're under contract. Now, this doesn't show their contract details all the way out, but we'll talk about those specifically because a few contract extensions or a few longer-term deals that we've given have different setups within their cap hits that can be utilized, and also maybe some flexibility within those as well. But in terms of just who's under contract right now, the biggest thing, and this has been a takeaway for the last few years, though, is that the Lions do have a lot of their key pieces seemingly under contract, right? That is very clear. It's like, okay, the Lions have good players under contract and a lot of needs, things that you would consider needs. It's a little bit nitpicking when you get to certain spots here. Like the defensive line, I kind of went in order here. So for the defensive line's sake, obviously Aiden Hutchinson, fifth-year option was picked up. We're going to extend that piece. And I did put some of the numbers on the right side, but he's going to be a free agent in 2027 if you don't extend him. I expect him to get extended. He's going to have the biggest deal of any extension coming up here soon. Could make $40 million a year. Like, it's actually possible. He may be more in the high 30s range, but based on where the cap goes, it could be $40 million. Maybe missing some time hurts him a little bit. I'm not sure. Regardless, he's going to get paid a ton of money. I expect that to happen. But then you have a Lee McNeil, who's a free agent. He's through 2028 right now. However, the key was his deal, as you can see, is there's no guaranteed salary starting in 2027, which means, with so much of that being base salary, that number one, there's flexibility for the Lions to look at restructuring that contract. If they have to open up cap space in 2027 and beyond, they could go right to Willie McNeil to potentially look to do that, add some guarantees, and potentially bump down some of that base salary. There's also the option of another extension on top of this, which could open up some flexibility as well. So there's flexibility within his contract, even though there's some high cap hits. Tyreek, rookie, through 2029. He'll be a free agent in 2030. You have Braddock Martin still on here, even though Braddock Martin, I consider just not putting him on the list, but he is still under contract, so I just threw him on here. It's, whatever. Like Roy Lopez isn't on here, but he's under a one-year deal. I didn't include like Rocky Sin on this. Now, Rocky Sin, like guys like that, Marcus Davenport, these guys could be part of the future, but they have to earn it really first. They don't have long-term deals. The rookies are just here or the rookie deals because they already have the deal. That doesn't mean they can't be cut short. Colby Source could absolutely be cut short. Broderick Martin could absolutely be cut short, so it's not that important. But either way, he's here. And then the main key, though, would be Lee McNeil, Tyreek Williams, Aiden Hutchinson, Mekhi Wingo, who becomes a free agent in 2028, and then Amin Hassanin, we hope is going to be a big part of this as well, who becomes a free agent now in 2029 for being drafted this year with no fifth-year option. Hopefully, the Lions have pretty much their entire defensive line looking good for the future. Now, there could be some additions to that, potentially some depth. Obviously, if a guy like Broderick Martin doesn't connect this year, you're going to need a backup nose tackle. That could be Roy Lopez signing an extension. I think that's very likely. That's what ends up happening. Not on a large deal, but he gets an extension, a multi-year deal after the season. Is Zadarius Smith. You can almost consider him a supplementary piece because while he may not be long-term, he could supplement you for this year, but long-term he doesn't, so I didn't include him on this list. But a guy like Marcus Davenport, I could see him getting extended. I could see him playing himself into a contract extension. Josh Paschal, right? He's also a guy that 1 year left on his deal, didn't include it, but he's in that range.
And keep in mind the Josh Paschals and the Marcus Davenports and these 1 year deals, the Alquan Muhammad's. Keep in mind these players when we talk about Philadelphia later and specifically reference Josh Sweat and how they are planning to replace Josh Sweat and how so much important is what's around him, but then also how they went after 1 year deals, similar to what the Lions have.
Guys that get into 2026 and you're like, okay, what is the core of the Lions? What do the Lions have? Because the idea of a window closing is the idea, in my opinion, that, hey, basically after this season, what's left of the team, right? You don't have much left here. You have way too many deals that you're going to have to extend. You're not going to have any money. So your team is like, win now or it's over. Well, this is me making the case that, one, that's not really the case because you have a lot of guys that you consider already like good players on this team or hopefully are, but you put some legitimate investments to that are well beyond this upcoming season. Like guys that are most of these through 2027 at least. The headline there will be Jack Campbell, free agent in 2027. We'll have that 5th-year option that's attached as well, so Lions can go that route to add another year to that. His extension, I would project to be somewhere between 15 and 20 million based on the jump that he had this past season, especially if he can improve upon that, could be even higher. The 5th-year option, I say 15 million, but it'd probably be more, mainly because he doesn't have a Pro Bowl or All Pro yet, but if he gets one of those two, then that's going to push that number up. Right now, it's just playing time that he would meet the requirement for, but in terms of being like an All Pro or Pro Bowler, that could make that number more expensive if you want to give a 5th-year option, and he could be a very interesting name because he could potentially make more sense just to extend and just bypass the 5th-year option, depending on how many of those boxes he actually checks, because his 5th-year option could potentially be more expensive than what it would even be to just look at extending the player. You have Barnes through 2027. You have Reed now, so let's go to the cornerback room because really the linebacker one is the biggest one. If you want to point to what's a legitimate need beyond this season, right, into 2026, the legitimate need beyond this season is going to be another linebacker, whether that's an Alex Anzalone extension that comes along the road here soon, whether that's Zach Cunningham plays well and he gets a new deal, maybe that's a new addition, maybe that's a draft pick, maybe that's a free agent signing. The positive is linebacker is still one of the cheaper positional groups, especially if it's not at the top. Like the highest paid linebacker is like 20 million, and there's only like one guy making that money. It's not that expensive of a room in comparison to like defensive end. So if you do need a linebacker, it's not the worst position to have a need at, is needing another linebacker. You know, you don't maybe need to pay top of the market for that position. But beyond that, cornerback, that looks good too, right? You have DJ Reed, who's through 2027. You have Terrion Arnold and Rakestraw, both through 2027. The 5th-year option with Terrion Arnold as well, which could put him in through 2028. It's going to depend on Brian Branch getting an extension, but Kirby got his extension, so he's in through 2029, free agent in 2030. That's a void year for him. You also then have Dan Jackson, who's aligned with that as well. There's a possibility those two could play alongside each other if Branch is, of course, not brought back.
In terms of a window closing, it all seems to begin truly in 2029, where the Lions really don't have any players under contract, and a lot of the dead money that they have thrown to the back, specifically like you see with Kirby Joseph in 2030 at $39 million, where they've kept his cap hit very low. They don't have anyone under contract yet between those 2 years over $100 million in dead cap. Those will be the seasons where it begins of the Lions having to continue to leverage forward the rollover money year after year after year and valuing that. And then, of course, all of the draft picks over these seasons, it'll look like a completely new team alongside figuring out who's your quarterback, but also not knowing what the salary cap's going to look like either.
If he is extended, which I want to extend, you can see I put extend next to his name there, he becomes a free agent in 2027. So you still have him through 2026. So again, beyond this year, you still have him. And if you're looking at this, every player on this list is beyond this season. Every player on here is under contract next year at least. Every player on here. So if you're talking about a window closing, I mean, if you're saying 1 year, it's kind of hard to make that case because, again, Lions don't really have that many holes going into next year. So while they don't have a lot of cap space, they also don't have a lot of holes, which makes a ton of sense here. And again, a lot of these guys are proven good players. I'm projecting about $20 million a year for Brian Branch, maybe even higher, somewhere in that range. Now we go to the offense side of the ball. You would have Decker, Glasgow, Ratledge, Mahogany, Frazier, Manu, all of those guys under contract at least through 2026, with Glasgow being the key there because Graham Glasgow could legitimately be cut that season. You You could also look at just simply having a pay cut with Graham Glasgow. They could do nothing with the deal, but he would save $5.5 million if he was cut. He could be one that opens up space. We'll talk about him, but Taylor Decker under contract. Now he's another interesting one because he's through 2027 would be his last year. 28 would be the void year, but he has no guarantees after the 2025 season. So he's another guy that, one, if you look to cut him, structuring his deal if you needed to, but there's a lot of flexibility within his large cap numbers really after this season. And then Mahogany, of course, being on the rookie deal, Frazier and Manu, Frazier being drafted this season, Ratledge being drafted this season. Offensive line is going to be one of the really interesting spots because that's going to be the spots where lines could go from being one of the most expensive offensive lines year after year after year to being one of the cheapest offensive lines. And if they can hit on their draft picks, it's where they'll really find their flexibilities, where they're going to find their value. So let's go to the next side, which is going to be the rest of this graphic. Again, Sorstel would still be involved, assuming he doesn't get cut, but he may get cut this offseason. But Sorstel's in this. Penei Sewell, of course, got the extension, so he would be the one guy that really could end up being the only guy that's really making real money here in a couple of years. But he's through 2029. Goff becomes a free agent in 2029. Now, he does have an out after the 2027 season, so there is some flexibility towards the back end of his deal. You're also seeing that his cap hit is about $70 million this season, or excuse me, in 2026. This is a 2026 chart. So there's going to be some probably movement there with that deal.
It's opened or closed. I think a major key has to be the quarterback. But I think Goff is in a very interesting situation because after the second to last year of his deal, heading into 2028, you could save over $40 million by just cutting him with only $14 million in dead cap because there's no dead cap money. There's no void money set in 2029 after his contract expires. So the Lions can get out pretty cleanly by opening up a lot of cap space if they wanted to, and they were moving off him and they had a replacement at that time and maybe it didn't look great or you wanted to trade him, whatever that may be, they'd have flexibility. However, there's the flip side where because he has really no void money in his contract, 2029 almost feels like an option year where the Lions could look to, before 2029 even, extend him an extra season to keep him around in 2029 because if you look at the Lions' upcoming extensions as of now, the big ones between Brian Branch and Jack Campbell, a lot of these extensions at the high end will probably go through 2029. So with that being the case, depending on what the team looks like when you get to 2028, you could look at Goff as a short-term extension to keep him around maybe for 2 more years into 2030 if you feel like you're still knocking on that door of winning. And if you're not, him being 35, 36 years old, you could potentially get out of this contract pretty cleanly. Also, an early extension could be in play for an extra season because if you wanted to, say, restructure him in 2026 to drop the $70 million cap hit with also throwing an extra year on the contract, you could potentially spread out some of that money a little bit better. So it feels like an option here towards the end of Goff's contract, which to me opens the window even more because you can roll forward with Goff, but you're not necessarily locked into it once you get to the tail end of the contract. So for now, you feel really good. But when that time comes, if you have an option, you go that route. If you don't, you could always potentially look to just extend him to a shorter term deal and keep him around again if your team, depending on what the roster looks like, is going to be completely different at that time, is in a spot to win. But you have flexibility with the biggest cap number on your team within the quarterback by the time you get to the end of the deal, which is fantastic.
This is where things get a little bit tight because you're going to have Laporta through 2026, but then he becomes a free agent. I think he'll make probably somewhere between $16 and $20 million a year, depending on how this season goes. A lot of that's going to ride on what it looks like with John Morton. Brock Wright, of course, is in this mix as well through 2026. Then he has a void year, but even if you want to re-sign him, his deal is not going to if anything, it's probably just going to get cheaper than what it was at this time when San Francisco had that restricted free agency offer, which pushed that number up a little bit. Then potentially having some of these UDFAs. I mean, can Luke Deal stick around? Can Zach Horton stick around? Someone like that could add depth there for very cheap if they don't get cut. And then at receiver, you'd have St. Brown through 2028. You have J-Mo through 2026 with a fifth-year option. But you would have him through 2026. Beyond that, I'm looking at probably $25 to $30 million a year, roughly right now, that J-Mo would end up making on the market, but that could change because he has so much more that he could potentially put on the field. Tesla through 2028, Jahmyr Gibbs then through 2026, and then you would have the fifth-year option you could pick up to push him through 2027, which I think that you probably would. We'll see, but I think you probably would. And then $15 to $20 million a year. Again, he's kind of in a weird spot because running back like linebacker still doesn't get paid a ton of money. You have a couple that are outliers, but they really don't in general. And him being part of a split back usage, I don't know where that number goes, but I would look to give him the fifth-year option of me some Sione Vaki. So I'm not giving up on Vaki being a big part of this still going forward. And then the biggest need would be special teams. You don't have any special teams players really signed through 2026, kicker, punter, long snapper. So all of that's going to be a need. So essentially what you're looking at here is through 2026, the Lions' legitimate needs through 2026 are a linebacker number 3, because you're going to have Jack and you're going to have Derek Barnes, so potentially a third linebacker into that mix. That price could very much so vary. A wide receiver number 5, a safety 3 or 4, depending on what you do with that positional group. But you're going to need another safety. It's just, what does Dan Jackson look like, right? You're going to need basically a backup safety, maybe a couple there. You would need a 4th cornerback, because at this point, Amik Robertson would be a free agent. Now you could bring him back. You would have Rakestraw, Terrion, and DJ Reed, of course. So you'd have flexibility there to even play one of those guys in the slot. Reed could play in the slot. So you're going to be good there. You're just going to need simply depth. And then maybe a backup defensive end, depending on how that shakes out. Maybe a starting defensive end. Maybe one of those guys could extend it. Maybe Ahmed's a starter. I don't know. But you're going to need a defensive end probably somewhere there. And then you need some special teams. That's your needs in 2026. So while you don't have a lot of cap space, you also don't really have a lot of holes. And again, this isn't fully projection. This isn't me saying like, oh man, hey, these are just guys. I mean, I'm just no, these are legitimate pieces, or they're very heavy investments. I mean, you still have Lovett as well, so Lovett adds a little bit of depth to the receiver room as well there. But these are legitimate investments. Like Isaac Tesla was a legitimate investment. I think he's going to be a core piece of this. Let's go here first, and I want to look at. There are a few contracts that are set up very interestingly for the Lions going forward that have long-term deals. So we said Jared Goff has basically a $70 million cap hit in 2026. I think that will very likely be restructured. And when we talk about kind of the plan, I'm going to restructure Jared Goff after this season. Now, you could have an extension there. After the season, his cap drops to $54 million. And then the next year, it'd be $61.6. You could potentially have that, and those numbers even themselves out a little bit more. St. Brown slightly, because St. Brown, his cap number actually does drop. 2027, you go into 2028, his cap number actually still slightly drops down a little bit. So, again, setup feels like a little bit backwards versus the cap space.
And similarly to Goff, St. Brown's contract aligns pretty much the same way, where there's an out into that 2028 season, but also an extension could potentially drop that cap hit that year. So there's a lot of flexibility towards the back end of his deal. But St. Brown and Kirby, two guys that are looking at real void money towards the end of their contracts once it expires, like Kirby at $39 million in 2030, both of them have their void number spread out through multiple years. So it could look to an extension for a guy like St. Brown at 29 years old, lower numbers, but at 29 could easily be in line for an extension. And if that is the case, say for both of them, they could lap those numbers back into a new deal so it doesn't all hit at once within 1 year where they have these monster numbers they have to deal with. So they can continue to keep those numbers spread out if they continue to perform through their contract. However, you could make a strong case that Kirby's contract feels a little bit more risky than a St. Brown. St. Brown has a clear out into that final year of his contract. You could get off him in that final year of his contract and it'd be very reasonable for a team with the dead cap and the money saved, versus Kirby, who, if he doesn't get extended, will have a pretty significant dead money number once he becomes a free agent. Now, we don't know where the cap's going to be and how that plays into the percentage, but about $40 million is very expensive. However, that risk is kind of being ran by the fact that the Lions gave him the extension. They kept his cap numbers very low, which they typically don't do throughout his entire contract. As we see with Goff and Saint, a lot of these players have outs towards the back end because of how they continuously run the contract. For Kirby, uniquely, they kept his cap numbers very low. However, when you get to the back end, there's a strong void number. So if he doesn't get extended into a new deal that wraps back in, there's going to be probably eating a pretty significant number of change or money at that time that you'll have to work around. But depending on where the cap is, maybe it's not that significant. Now, with all this being said, I would argue that the Lions' big difference is towards the back end. While there is some void money, it's nothing like what Philadelphia has set for 2029. It's not as aggressive between their players across the board. It may get there, but it doesn't seem anywhere near that kind of landing spot for 2029, though there is some void money there. And the Lions are trying to maintain that flexibility by not making every deal look like that Kirby Joseph deal.
Interesting one is DJ Reed. DJ Reed got the long-term deal with the Lions, but in 2027, his cap number drops to 8. In 2026, it's 18. In 2027, it drops to 8. In 2028, it's back up to $17 million, and then he has a void year. Real flexibility there within his contract as well. Derek Barnes in 2027, his cap number drops down to $4.3 million versus $9 million the year before in 2026. He then drops to 4. So you got multiple players that are set up in the same kind of way throughout their contracts. Typically, it's going to be more set up like Penei Sewell, where it's like, hey, it's going to go up each year, $28 million to $32 million in 2027. It's going to go up each year, you would expect, but a couple of these don't do that. One thing Philadelphia has been able to really tap into recently has been, and they've done this for a while now, but especially recently we're really seeing the results here, is the ability to take advantage of comp picks. So you want to keep around your players, the players that you draft, and you got to make those tough extension decisions. The flip side of that is, how do you replenish a roster if you're losing guys in free agency that are big parts of your team and you just can't afford to pay it? Well, in the NFL, it comes back to comp picks. And we got a little taste of that. The Lions were able to take advantage of their comp picks. And look, everybody wants to say, man, you lost all these coordinators. Well, part of that was the benefit was you actually got a third-round pick back for Aaron Glenn. Now, we've already spent that to go up and get Isaac Tesla, but that was really a glimpse of like, okay, we're going to continue to get comp picks. Teams have multiple players that could be eligible for adding comp picks to the Lions in the draft. So, for example, if you look at Philadelphia this offseason, how did they acquire comp picks going forward? Well, one, Milton Williams signed a monster deal with New England. Milton Williams was the role player for them. He signs a monster contract. They get a third-round pick back for Milton Williams. A third-round comp pick is as good as it can get for losing Milton Williams in free agency because they didn't really replace him. That's one guy that they didn't really replace at all if you look at it. So you could say, well, Jalen Carter. Well, Carter was already there. So they have Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis, two guys that were already there. Their replacement for Milton Williams was essentially nothing. Losing Josh Sweat. Sweat was there for a long time. He outprices them this offseason. So he goes, they get a fourth-round pick in return. He signs like $19 million a year. How do they replace that? They replaced it with short-term deals, Azeez Ojulari, Josh Uche, short-term, one-year deals, prove-it deals essentially that can get some reps, alongside Jalix Hunt, who was a mid-round pick, and also the taking off of Nolan Smith within that defense. But their way that they've addressed that, they're looking at this as they're bringing in one-year deals. They're bringing in guys that can take snaps, and then again, they're leaning on their youth, and they're also leaning on guys like Moro Ojomo that can get more snaps, right? Going from about 80 to 380. Mekhi Becton leaves and brings a fifth-round pick in exchange. Now, the key about Mekhi Becton is he's actually very interesting because a lot of these articles who make the case that the Lions Super Bowl window is closing, and the only reason it's closing is because they lost their coordinators and they lost Frank Ragnow. For whatever reason, that was like, oh, that's the window. Well, Philadelphia also went through not only losing both their coordinators, having to replace them a couple of times, but also losing their center. They lost Jason Kelsey. We all remember that. They didn't skip a beat. How did they replace him? Well, they had Cam Jurgens, who they already had drafted, a second-round pick, who also went from guard to center, which I believe Tate Ratledge is going to do, so you could find some similarities just in that path alone. So they had that. And then when he retired, how did they fill the guard spot? They went out and signed to a one-year, $2 million deal, Mekhi Becton. They brought in Mekhi Becton on a one-year, $2 million deal, and he took over the guard position. He then goes out and signs a multi-year deal this offseason after going to guard from tackle, and now stepping into that role, how do they replace it? Well, a guy that was already on the roster. Tyler Steen is likely going to replace him in that role at the guard position. That's kind of their next step up is Tyler Steen. So he was already there, a former third-round pick. How do the Lions replace Frank Ragnow? Well, for me, it's going to be Tate Ratledge going from guard to center, a second-round pick, even though he hasn't been in the league yet, which is the biggest difference here. But that's going to be the replacement eventually. Maybe it's not right away, but eventually. Could be Glasgow in the short term, right? Having that veteran. For them, it was Mekhi Becton. For us, it could be a Graham Glasgow. But then also on top of that, it could be a Miles Frazier, who we've already now drafted. So you could have actually a little bit more flexibility, or maybe that's Miles Frazier down the road. I think he's starting level, which is kind of like what happened with Tyler Steen down the road. It wasn't immediate, but down the road, he's going to become the replacement. It seems like at guard. It could be next year that Miles Frazier becomes the replacement at guard. It could be in 2 years. 2 years he could become the replacement at guard. So it doesn't have to happen immediately, but similarly, just like Philadelphia, we're kind of doing a very similar thing on the offensive line. And then also on top of that would be losing Isaiah Rodgers, who was a role piece in that back end. Losing him, they end up getting a 6th-round comp pick for that in exchange. And who's the replacement? Keely Ringo, who hasn't really played a ton. Keely Ringo stepping in alongside two young guys. So they've done this, and they're doing basically the same thing that the Lions are going to have to start doing going forward. And I'm going to give you some examples of how that could shake out this upcoming season. A couple of guys that are eligible to potentially give the Lions some legitimate comp picks. The biggest one is Levi. Levi could notch, I believe, at its highest level, a 3rd-round pick this year. That would be the 2027 draft, not 2026. But he could notch the Lions a 3rd-round pick. Role could be massive to begin the year. You don't have a Lee McNeil healthy. He could come in as a starter alongside DJ Reader as Tyleek rotates in. So one way that I found, and you're looking at all these names, Milton, Sweat, and Becton, and Rodgers, and you're like, okay, well, why did this work? Right? What's the recipe for these guys having success? I would argue it's what you have around them. Okay, first off, give them credit. But secondly, what they have around them matters. The supporting cast, who also was in that position group with them. Who is the supporting cast around them to make them look better? Well, if you look at the Lions and you look at a guy like Levi, for example, who's around him? DJ Reader, a 1st-round pick in Tyleek Williams that can rotate in with him, Aiden Hutchinson, and then Davenport / Josh Pascal / Ahmed Hassanin, right? Even though some people have some questions there, you have by PFF rankings the 6th best defensive line in football this year. On top of that, you have by PFF rankings the 2nd best linebacker room this year, and that is dependent on Alex a little bit as well. That's your supporting cast. Is you have cornerback room, you have DJ Reed, who they ranked 6th. You have a first-round pick there. And then you go to the safety room, arguably the best safety room in football. I'd make that case. So supporting cast-wise, you should have the supporting cast there for a guy like that to take off this season, right? That should be in play. And I think Levi could absolutely get a Milton Williams type of deal because Milton Williams wasn't a full-time player. Dude was rotational. He just had a great run. Levi started to show last year that he was capable of that. I thought he was going to get a monster deal this offseason. I would assume he was looking for it, didn't get it. He comes back on a one-year deal for the Lions, has an opportunity to play a lot, especially early. If he has a monster impact early on in the season, and as we go forward, he shows that flexibility, he's going to get a monster deal just because of that position alone. Maybe not to the Williams extent. He's going to get a big deal. I'll say safely, he notches us a 4th-round comp pick. Let's argue that he gives us a 4th-round comp pick for what he does this year, and he walks in free agency. Next up would be Amik Robertson. He may very well start in the slot this year for the Lions. Now, I don't think he'll get as high of a pick in return, but if he starts in the slot, with that being the supporting cast that we just laid out, the defensive line, the linebacker room, the safety position, specifically for him, D-line and safety, because he's going to be playing into that, or even linebackers because of the role that he plays. If you look at that and say, okay, how well is he going to do in that role? Well, could he notch the Lions a 6th-round pick in return, similar to Isaiah Rodgers? Maybe even higher than that because he could be a starter for the Lions if we just let him walk in free agency and he goes and signs a deal that's worth being a starter in free agency, that is inside-outside flexibility. That's very possible. And if he does that, which is very possible, he could absolutely notch the Lions a 6th-round pick, a 5th-round pick, maybe higher, maybe a little bit lower in the 2027 draft as well because the Lions, how are they going to replace it? Well, probably one-year deals, probably draft picks because they could very well have all of their starters in place. They don't necessarily need to go out there and say we need to find a slot because we lost Amik because that could be Reed / Rakestraw, right? That could be a guy that can just kick in. Like Reed, it doesn't mean taking Reed and just making him a slot all the time, but that can mean, hey, 3 receiver packages, Reed kick in, Rakestraw stay wide. 2 receiver packages, Rakestraw get off, Reed and Terrion, you hold it down. That could be the Lions cornerback room. On top of that, you have Branch's flexibility that could step into that role. You could potentially look at him as a long-term slot again if you wanted to, and then you just add a safety depth back into the mix there with Dan Jackson, a Brian Branch extension, and having Kirby Joseph under contract. So because of all of that, he has flexibility to land you a deal. DJ Reader not go out in free agency and sign a reasonable contract this offseason, sign a $8 million multi-year deal this offseason, potentially, and how do Lions replace that? Tyleik Williams. They'll replace it with Tyleik. They'll replace it with Lee McNeil, and then they'll maybe give it Rolly Lopez an extension, right? That could be in-house, so they could potentially land a comp pick from a DJ Reader. On top of that, you could also look at guys like, because, I mean, just to give some perspective there on why that's possible, like, I don't want to just be saying that. Onyemata got an $11 million per year deal in free agency at 33 years old. We just saw Minnesota go out and sign defensive tackles, specifically defensive tackles that were not coming off of great years, to monster deals this offseason as well. So it's not impossible to think that he could land you something back as a comp pick. Other names I would throw out there is Josh Paschal, Marcus Davenport. If it's not back with us, but if they play well, those guys, if both of them played well, one could leave, one could stay, you could get a comp pick for that potentially. I'm not even counting those, but you could. Khalif Raymond, I mean, at the very back end, maybe, as a returner, replaced with Dominic Lovett, that could potentially lead to a comp pick.
A scenario that I think is very possible, say Tim Patrick holds off Isaac Tesla for a strong part of this season. Again, you wouldn't expect Patrick to get a large deal, but if he holds him off and production is similar, maybe even a little bit better than last year, 37 receptions, 400 yards, and then Tesla takes over as a starter, maybe you could get a 7th for that. There could be a path to potentially grabbing a 7th-round pick if he could potentially boost those stats even a little bit more by holding off Tesla, starting from the jump, and having a similar production type of season. I mean, you got guys like Josh Palmer, who much younger, yes, maybe more so towards the Khalif side there, 40 receptions, 600 yards, earn him a 3-year, $10 million per year type of deal. So I'm not projecting either of these, but they're both possible scenarios.
Additional pick and him meeting that requirement, the Lions could have all their original picks plus 2 4th-round picks plus 2 6th-round picks and maybe not a 7th-round pick on the safe side. And that's how the Lions will supplement replacing and replenishing their roster going forward, is doing what Philadelphia has been able to do. So that's really the main strategy that the Lions will have to implement. They've always wanted to build to the draft. Well, this is continuing to follow down that path of being able to do that. So now let's talk about these tough decisions very quickly. How do the Lions make these tough decisions? Because we all understand that they're coming down the road here. Well, the first thing I want to start off is, what is the Lions' cap situation? So we know what it is right now. Lions got a lot of cap space, right? $48 million according to Spotrac right now, and that is based on the Frank Ragnow contract. How
So
they
let's
want to
just say
do
on
it.
the
Frank
safe
Ragnow
side, the
retires.
Lions
Do they want
earn
to
a
get
fourth-round
post-June
pick and a
first?
sixth-round
Do they
pick
want to just run
and
it
comp
as
picks
a,
for
you know, okay, he
2027.
just retired.
That would go
Let's
on
eat more of
top
that
of
cap
the
hit
Lions
right now,
having
the dead cap
all
that's
of their
there
original
now,
picks,
and we'll open up
maybe
more
not
next
the
year.
seventh-round pick in
Regardless, they're going to be
2027
saving
due to
about
the Riley
$21
Patterson
million
trade.
over the next couple of seasons. However, they decide to line that up, and we'll take Spotrac's way of doing that, for example, just to keep this thing consistent. And if we do that, saving about $21 million over the next 2 years for his retirement. So that's going to open up some cap space.
Spotrac lists the Lions with $292.429 million, all cap allocations for in season. Because remember, once the regular season starts, the top 51 goes away. But at that time, teams are also cutting down their roster. So let's just make a rough projection saying we cut down to a 53-man roster, and let's say that's $900K per player, because some are like $800K, others are $1 million, some are $1.1 million. This won't be exact, but let's just take that as an idea. And that would give you $22.5 million between those 25 players that would be cut to shrink that roster. So if we take that $292 million, that's all in paid during the season, minus that $22.5 million, we fall in at $269 or $270 million. Take that $270 million away from the adjusted cap space with the rollover for this year, and the Lions are looking at like $36.5 million in cap space. We can also take off $5 to $10 million there. However, say if you want to take off 10, say we're at $26 million, take off 5, say we're at $30 million, roughly somewhere in that range for the practice squad. Of course, you need money during the season. So I would say safely about $26 million, very safely, $26 million that the Lions could potentially push over into next year, I think on a conservative end of things. And of course, this also doesn't account for like a Tate Ratledge contract that hasn't come in yet, but this is just a rough estimate, and this is much more than the 14 projected rollover that they currently have listed for 2026, once you take into account the 53-man roster that will be intact.
If we take the projected number of what Spotrac is projecting the Lions to actually have, or what the cap number to be, we don't know what the cap number is going to be next year. That hasn't been set, but when it is, if we just take their set number and we then tie in the rollover cap to that, the Lions would be in $4 million over the cap, negative $4 million in cap space next year. So $4 million over the cap. Now, that's not great, but we just showed you there's not a lot of needs next year. So if we just look at it from a 2026 perspective, you don't really have any holes. Let's say you have $4 million roughly over the cap next year with your rollover cap from this year. That's where you're sitting at financially. If that is the case for the Lions, what is the plan? Well, let's talk about it. First things first is I would look at it like this. Goff may very well get a restructure. Let's say we restructure $25 million of Goff's base salary. Let's say that. If we do that, we could save roughly $19 million for that 2026 season. So now that puts us at about $15 million in cap space for 2026. That's the first and major move. I won't go over everything here, but let's just say we start there. Okay, we did that. We got $15 million. In Glasgow, you could very well cut Graham Glasgow. If he's cut, you save $5.5 million. That's the next thing that we look at. I would look at, for him, if you want to keep him around because he plays well, maybe you look at offering him a pay cut, right? Because if you did that, you kept him around, then you could potentially look to extend him beyond this season as a really valuable depth piece on a very short and a very cheap contract. That's something the Lions could look at potentially doing rather than just doing an outright cut. But that could potentially save them money as well. I would also look at, starting in 2027, the idea of cutting Taylor Decker. Now, that's going to be a big one because you have to feel good about where Manu is. But say Manu looks really good, takes a big step in the preseason. If the Lions get to that point where they feel comfortable with it, a big money saver for them could be cutting a guy like Taylor Decker, which could open up $17 million in cap space if he was cut in 2027. $17.8 million would be saved if he was cut then, plus the $3 million void money on top of the $6.2 million in dead money.
And now look, both of these maybe could be trades as well. We could consider that. But for this sake, I'm just saying cut. If we're talking 2027, that's also where you get to the point of a Dave Montgomery at 30 years old, make a decision with him. He would also be in a spot where now he has a very strong out versus the year before. But now you're saving $7.7 million with a cut with barely any dead money.
So Lions could save about $18 million if they cut Taylor Decker in 2027. If they felt good about Manu, they could go that route. That's opens up a lot more cap space. So now you're looking at it from that perspective. Okay, that's how the Lions open up cap space. Basically, the big difference is you go from the offensive line that the Lions had paid a ton, over the last couple of years, top 5, top 4, top 3 in terms of spending at that position, to dropping that number way down to Sewell's really the only guy getting paid, and the rest of it's young guys, maybe a veteran here or there to supplement. That's pretty much it. So that number is going to drop big time if some of those young guys hit. If none of them hit, you're in a tough spot. But that's why you build through the draft. That's the idea of building through the draft, is that you can do this so that you can keep a lot of these players. How do you do that? You have to draft well. That's why I have no issue with trading up for Tate or trading up for Tesla, because if you believe in those players and you go and invest in them in the draft, they should work. And if they do hit, I don't even want to look in day 3 picks, but let's just say they hit, like, I mean, Mahogany looks like a hit. He's a day 3 pick. If Frazier hits, you could be looking at opening up a lot of flexibility to keep a lot of these players around, and now you just get younger at the offense line. Now all of a sudden that spending drops significantly. What I would do plan-wise on top of all of this, I would look at, after making those moves, extending Hutchinson. Let's say he gets $38 million a year. That's something that I think is a non-negotiable. You extend Hutchinson. Now, the key to that is the fact of, okay, how do those numbers actually set up going forward? That's going to be the key to an Aiden Hutchinson contract. Well, I would look at it as majority of that starts to kick in 2027, because for Aiden Hutchinson, he now has signed a 5th-year option, so he's also under contract next year already for the $19 million, which is very reasonable. 2027, you could start a little bit low, or you could have a lot of that hit in 2027, depending on how you set up the rest of the contracts, because as you're seeing, Lions have a lot of contracts kind of dropping down in 2027. You could look at kind of lapping a lot of that money immediately in 2027, where the Lions don't have a lot of money into 2026. You could look at doing something like that. So that's a must. You get that deal done. Another thing that you could look at here, and again, we have the Reed cap number dropping, which helps a lot. I would say that it's a requirement that you extend Brian Branch. Early projection, I would extend Brian Branch about $20 million per season. Then I would look at Jamison Williams versus Sam Laporta. One of those could very well be traded. Now, I'm not saying trade them right now. Maybe keep both. Maybe you just figure it out and you say, hey, both these guys earned that. We'll move on someone else, right? Maybe we don't bring back Brian Branch. I don't know. But for me, early on, maybe you don't bring back Jack Campbell. Me, early on, the early thought for me would be, I look at it as one of those two potentially get traded. I don't want to say who because I don't know. It depends, right? If Sam Laporta takes a big step back in a John Moore offense because tight ends haven't historically been that productive in an offense, then I can't say, oh, extend Laporta, trade J-Mo, because maybe J-Mo's amazing and you need J-Mo to make this thing work and he goes for 1,600 yards. Well, I'm prioritizing that. Maybe I have flexibility and I trade off of Laporta. I love him, and maybe that's the option. But if one of them were traded, let's say hypothetically it's J-Mo. Say you extended Sam Laporta because financially he's going to be more reasonable based on his position. You trade J-Mo, say he's in the range of $25 to $30+ million per season. You trade him. Similarly, a guy, let's say J-Mo goes for another 1,000 yards. A guy that got a compensation of a 1st and 3rd round pick, and even though this didn't work out for that team, it was Tennessee. They got a 1st and 3rd round pick for a guy that had 2,000-yard seasons. That was A.J. Brown during the draft. The Lions could potentially look to acquire, if he had another 1,000-yard season, a 1st and a 3rd round pick. Now, maybe less because you would be trading him, to me, in my scenario, in his 5th year. I wouldn't trade him this year. I would trade him in his 5th year. The draft, you trade him before that 5th year option, which means it's going to be more expensive, but you trade him then so you can get this year. Then you have more clarity on what's Isaac Tesla. What do you need then in the draft? Give yourself more of a chance. Don't do it now. Get a legitimate big return like that. We've seen it happen. If you got that kind of return, maybe that's something you consider. Then you have more flexibility to extend a guy like potentially a Sam Laporta. So you can make that decision between the two there. And when you tie all of that together with the comp picks, and you're looking at having all your picks plus a couple of additional comp picks on top of that, that's how the Lions are going to extend their window. How do they make it work? Avoiding mistakes. Make sure that you trade the right player. You're going to have to let some players walk, unfortunately, right? Alex Anzalone could very well walk. I think part of this would be letting Alex walk after this year. Even let's just assume he plays this year. He walks after this year. That allows you to potentially extend Jack Campbell, because then Jack Campbell, Derek Barnes' contract is essentially over in 2027. I mean, he's got a 3-year deal, but his 2027 cap hit drops down to $4 million. That's nothing. So I would look to extend Jack Campbell, because I would just look at it as I'm really not paying any linebackers after 2026. So if I extend Jack Campbell and really have his cap hit jump in 2027, then essentially I could look at it as, okay, he's really the only linebacker getting paid in that room. Maybe you get Malcolm Rodriguez on a multi-year deal, and he becomes the player to replace Alex Anzalone, but on a very favorable contract because he's been a backup. That could be your potential future at that backer position. So ultimately here, there's a lot of ways this could go, but the Lions are absolutely extending this window beyond. This is not a, hey, the Lions need to win right now or it's over. It's not that. Lions are going to roll over a lot of cap. They're going to continue to lean on building through the draft. They're going to have the comp picks to do it, and they're going to have to make difficult decisions, but they're going to have clarity when they make those decisions. So I appreciate y'all joining. We can always revisit this. There's so much to talk about, but I'm going to leave it here. Have a great Monday.